The Rebel Capitalist Show. All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to bring someone back to the Rebel Capitalist Show. He is my good buddy, and he hosts my favorite podcast on macroeconomics. And that's saying a lot because I actually have a podcast on macroeconomics. I like it better than my own. His name is Erik Townsend. Welcome back, buddy.
Wow, what an intro, George. Thanks so much. It's great to be back.
All right. Now, I usually just kind of rattle off random questions, but I want to be very specific because I know you've given a lot of thought to what's happening in the world today. So starting off, why don't we just kind of go over your big picture and how you see things playing out? I mean, it's a big day today. I was just looking at the news and we got another inversion of the twos and tens. We've got oil, which I know is your specialty. Last time I looked at it, down about $96, gold down. I mean, everything's screaming recession. So what do you think's going on here?
George, I think we're headed into a global recession. And, it's the ingredients are basically you start with the COVID crisis, which happened at a time when the economy was not doing all that great. You go to not just double barrel, but quadruple barrel economic stimulus from every central bank on earth. That prevents the recession from happening when it should have happened and just delays it. So we kick the can down the road. Now we've got a situation where inflation is starting to run away. That means that central bankers are not as easily able to just accommodate with easy money policy in order to stimulate the markets, and now things start to get dicey. Meanwhile, I think we have a setup for a huge, just crazy food and energy price inflation. And it's not going to be driven by monetary inflation per se. It's just a combination of circumstances. Right now, with respect to this Ukraine-Russia war, really, if you look at what's happened, Russia's not playing hardball yet. We've got increased oil prices, but that's because of Western sanctions. The West said we're going to impose these sanctions on Russian oil. Russia didn't do anything. I think Russia is waiting for a more opportune time to really play hardball, particularly as Europe, as we get into the fall, and Europe really, really needs that Russian gas that they have no substitute for. I think we could get into a situation at that point where Russia really starts to play tough and it gets much harder for the West. Meanwhile, all of the fertilizer that's used to produce most of the crops around the world comes primarily from Russia, and actually a lot of it comes from Canada. The potash that's used to make fertilizer, but a lot of the Canadian productive capacity has been idled intentionally. So I hope Canada brings that production back online. But we've got a situation just brewing right now where I think food prices could go through the roof. And so far, even though Russia gets blamed for everything by the White House, it seems to be their favorite scapegoat. The reality is Russia hasn't done anything proactively to impose pain on the West economically. That doesn't mean they're not going to. I think that's coming, but they haven't done it yet. So far, these have been self-inflicted wounds. So I think we've got a setup for a global recession, but it's a recession that will probably be met with continuing food and energy price inflation that's not going to go away. So it's a really screwed up situation.
Yeah, a couple things there. What do you think about the Nord Stream pipeline being shut down for, I think it's 2 weeks because of maintenance I read yesterday? And I in the back of my head, just being a skeptic, I'm like, oh, well, I guess that may be Putin sending a message to Germany saying, let me show you how much leverage we have over you guys come winter. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's definitely about how much leverage they have come winter. Whether or not this pipeline shutdown is a specific messaging technique, I don't know, could be.
Yeah.
One way or another, I think that it's come winter that things are going to get tough. And there is no alternative. Biden just kind of brushed this under the table and said, oh, look, we're going to provide as much American liquefied natural gas as they need, and we'll take care of Europe. It's going to be okay. Where's he going to get that gas? I mean, we have the gas in the United States, but we have no way of delivering it. And we just lost one export terminal to an explosion. And there's not enough ships to deliver liquefied natural gas on. So we're not going to solve the problem with American natural gas. We're getting into a situation where there's going to be a real crunch. And for now, the West is still, throwing angry rhetoric around, trying to piss the Russians off even more.
Right.
I think that Putin is waiting this out. He knows that his strength comes when Europe has no other choice for fall and winter heating from gas. And I think he's waiting this out. Meanwhile, the West is acting very arrogantly. And, you know, I'm not questioning that Russia has done some really nasty things. And I'm not saying they're good guys, but they are a very, very powerful nation. It's a nuclear superpower. It's not Iraq and Afghanistan that we're picking a fight with this time. And it's true that Putin has been the one to pick the fight with Ukraine, but we've very much gotten in between those two. And, you know, everybody says, oh, well, can't you be more sympathetic to the people of Ukraine? Well, what about the people of Yemen? That war has been going on for 8 years, but the people that are perpetrating the atrocities on Yemen are Saudis, and they're friends of ours. We don't, you know, that war is not mentioned on
Right.
CNN. So it's only for crazy guys like you that cover topics like that. So, you know, it's a bad situation, but I don't think it's anywhere close to as bad as it's going to get, because Russia's not playing hardball yet. And I think they're waiting out the summer.
Yeah. The pushback I always get with that argument is, well, we have to do something. We got to do something. I'm like, okay, I get that, but that something can't be you going into a fight with Mike Tyson, and before he hits you, you're punching yourself in the face. I go, that we need to take that option off the table.
Well, we could also take some of the things that are being discussed right now, which Russia sees as provocation. You know, putting a military base in Poland. George H.W. Bush promised Gorbachev that there would be no further expansion of NATO east of where they already were at the time. And, you know, it's since there's been a huge amount of encroachment on Russia's borders, they have a very legitimate issue there. And it doesn't justify the human rights atrocities that are going on, but they do have legitimate issues, and we don't bother talking about that on Western media.
Well, speaking of Western media, let's move over to your, I'm sure one of your next maybe interviewees on Macro Voices, Mr. Joe Biden. And he seems to be a brilliant macroeconomist. So tell us about the Putin price hikes and why that may be more about the Biden price hikes.
Well, I do think it's a Biden price hike, and you know, Joe Biden is not the first president to scapegoat foreigners for his own policy errors. But the way we got to this inflation, and the people who predicted the inflation said that it was Biden's policies that were going to get us there. And one of the ways that this has come about has been Biden has just attacked the energy industry to the point where we've lost refining capacity, and there's really no business case to build any new refineries in the United States, because everybody can see that we're really pushing toward eliminating fossil fuels, and the payback on refineries are incredibly expensive to build. So if you're going to build one from scratch, there's got to be a 20-year payback on that investment, right. And nobody wants to invest in building that. So we're losing refining capacity. President Biden was for a while attacking the refiners and saying, you know, we need to get rid of these businesses. We need to get rid of them because they're the enemy, and, you know, green energy is the future. You can't phase out the old before you phase in the new, and we haven't phased in the new. So we've got a real problem here with refining capacity that's getting worse. The energy crisis is going to get worse. It's just going to result in higher prices. And so far, all of these sanctions, you know, the effort that Biden and Europe have put forth in order to make it look to their constituents like they're getting tough with Russia, in reality, the result has been higher prices for Americans and Europeans. China's getting a discount because Russia is now selling their oil to China and India at a discount. Saudi Arabia is now going to sell more oil to Europe and less oil to China because China's going to buy more of it from Russia at a discount. Russia has higher oil revenues now than they ever had before this war started. And Americans and Europeans are paying much more at the pump. So these policies have just backfired spectacularly. We haven't punished Russia in any way, shape, or form. What we have done is punished American and European consumers. We've set the stage for an energy crisis to go just off the rails over the course of this summer. And I'm very concerned as to where that could take us, because everybody's the markets are now correctly pricing in a recession. Everybody assumes in a recession, price of oil has got to go back down to 65. Well, we're seeing the price of oil collapse on that sentiment right now. Everybody who had speculative long interest in oil is getting out. They're panicking. They think the recession means it's all over. I think that what's going to make the recession worse is higher energy prices. Right. And one of the things that I'm seeing right now is and this is, we're speaking on Tuesday. This is, I don't know when this is going to air, but it'll change quickly. But as we've seen the price look like maybe we hit a bottom there just above 95, maybe we've still got farther to go to the downside. Why is oil selling off so much? Well, oil's selling off so much because the market's pricing in a recession. Everybody's saying, oh gosh, long-term holders of speculative oil, if there's a recession coming, we got to sell it because there's a recession. Surely that means it has to go down. But if I look at the time spreads, that's the difference in price from one contract month to the next, they're exploding at the front of the curve. That means the physical market guys are saying, we are out of oil. We don't know where the next barrel is going to come from. And as you've seen this dramatic sell-off in the prices of outright oil futures, the time spreads, which are a more direct measure of the physical market tightness, they haven't come down hardly at all. They're basically trading where they were when we were last at the current oil price. The time spreads were like half of what they are now, and they haven't come down hardly at all. And just this morning, they've actually started to explode even further. So I think that the physical market is saying, we got a real problem. Energy prices are not coming down. But necessarily, if you get a whole bunch of macro traders who think that that a recession is coming, and that surely has to mean reduced demand and lower energy prices, they're selling crude oil futures. So that's the reason for the sell-off. I think that the sell-off will be relatively short-lived. Maybe it's got further to go to the downside because, as everybody says, oh my gosh, recession is certain now. People are selling energy because they don't know what else to do. I think that it will be short-lived and that you'll see a spectacular rebound. And before the summer is out, we'll see higher energy prices than we've seen yet, above $130. We'll see what happens.
That makes a lot of sense because everyone's just looking at the demand side of the equations. And yes, maybe demand comes down significantly, but to a certain degree, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the demand for oil is very inelastic, even in a recession. And you can have demand go down slightly, but if supply goes down even faster, then you still got prices going up.
Well, I do think that there's one element of this where it did have room to come down, which is European and American sanctions on Russian oil caused a lot of speculation that pushed the price higher. Well, in reality, they didn't stop Russia from selling their oil to India and China. They're going to sell the oil to India and China. That means India and China will have less demand for Saudi Arabia and other producers. It'll all balance out. So that speculative froth from American and Europe imposed sanctions needed to come out of the market, and it has come out of the market now. I think that's a healthy reset of where the market should be. But what hasn't even begun to be priced in is Putin playing hardball as we get into the fall and prices going dramatically higher, because we really have a marginal barrel problem, that there's just no way to satisfy immediate demand and prices are going through the roof.
How do you see that playing out with the US CPI? Because I see energy, food, shelter, to your point, prices going up and up and up and up. But if there's not any new currency units that are going out to people, or if their incomes aren't increasing at the same rate, they're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul. So they're going to have to spend that money on energy, food, and shelter because that's very inelastic. So they're taking purchasing power away from other things that they may have bought, which reduces aggregate demand. So you kind of have this like this balancing act, right? I mean, do you see us kind of going into a recession of disinflation, where we still do have inflation, but it's just not at 8.6, it's at 7, 6, or 5? Or how do you see that playing out?
I think there's two waveforms superimposed on top of each other right now. You've got a very long-term secular inflation wave, which I think is just starting. It's still late 1960s right now. We're not even into the 70s yet. Okay, so we're just starting the secular inflation. Most people don't believe in that. They think it's a fantasy that's not real. They don't think inflation's ever coming back on a secular basis. I think it is. On top of that, you've got the ending of the pandemic and the supply chain challenges and the sudden increase in demand as the pandemic is coming off. That is resulting in inflation effects, which are in fact transitory. They're a result of the unwind of the COVID pandemic. So I think what happens from here is we got all the way up to 8, 9%, whatever the inflation print was. I think it's going to start to come off as everybody says, okay, it really was transitory. And they're right. The post-COVID effects of inflation are in fact transitory. So those are going to keep coming off. But then the secular inflation that underlies it is going to continue. And I think what you'll see is it's coming off, but it's not coming off as fast as people predicted it would. Wait a minute, it's going back up again. How can it be going back up again if we thought it was transitory? Well, what's going on is those transitory effects really are coming out of the system, but the secular effects are getting pushed back in. And remember that oil is an input cost to anything, everything on Earth. Either you consume oil in order to produce it, or there's something in it that's made from petroleum. Plastics and all kinds of stuff are made from petroleum. So if petroleum prices go through the roof this summer and fall, which I think is a very likely possibility, then you've got an input to inflation, which is self-reinforcing and really starts to, push everything else. And of course, the government will say, oh, wait a minute, food and energy, we don't include those in our core CPI. So let's not worry about that. Joe average consumer on the street, when he can't afford to buy fuel for his car to go to work, it's going to cause major problems. And yeah, there will be some demand destruction in the sense that, you say that the energy prices are really inelastic. And that's true as long as people live within their behavioral norms that they're accustomed to. Right. In the United States, most people don't even think about carpooling because they don't have to. They can afford to have their own car. It's a luxury that Americans are kind of spoiled with and used to. So the idea of carpooling or taking public transit instead of driving your own car doesn't really occur to Americans as an option until you get to $10 gas prices. Then it suddenly becomes very appealing. And I think that you have a setup. If I put myself in Putin's shoes and I say, okay, Biden is clearly trying to make me the bad guy. He wants to blame me for everything. He seems like he wants to be at war with me. So what do? Well, I could get angry right now and throw a conniption fit and do something, or I could just let the Americans and the Europeans do what they're doing, which is impose these ineffective sanctions, which are pushing the price of oil up. So I get paid more for my oil. I'm still selling all of my oil to India and China that I'm not selling to Europe and the United States. I'm doing just fine. Let's wait this out. And when we get to the fall, when they can't afford to deal with having the gas shut off, at that point, let's consider, and what I would think about if I was Putin right now is making a deal with China, saying, look, we need to continue producing oil, at least at some level, so we don't have to shut in our wells. but let's make a pact, China, that we're going to give you a great price to continue consuming oil, even when we take it off the market, on the condition that you also buy China, we want you to buy your oil that you're actually going to burn from Saudi Arabia. But we also want you to buy oil that you're going to stockpile for a rainy day. And that oil that you promised to stockpile, we're going to give you a great price on as Russia, because we need to do something to keep our oil production going through a period this fall and winter where we might intentionally take it off the market. Just tell the West that 4 million barrels of Russian oil is not available, and India and China are not going to, make up the difference. They're going to be stockpiling it, but they're still going to buy what they need to burn from Saudi Arabia and other suppliers, and that means you really are going to $300 a barrel or whatever it's going to be. And that's the point where you get to, and I think what Putin's going to say is just a very firm, hard line of, these sanctions that have been unfairly imposed on my country are political. They're not based on, we didn't do anything wrong. Our dispute with Ukraine is between us and Ukraine, and, stay out of it and eliminate all these sanctions. And when you eliminate all the sanctions and go back to business as usual and stop supplying arms to Ukraine, then we'll sell you oil again. But until you do that, we're taking it off the market. Now, in order for them to take it completely off the market, they would have to either shut in their producing wells or make some kind of deal with somebody, either in Russia or outside of Russia, where they could keep producing and stockpiling it. They're going to be able to sell it unless somebody blows it up with bombs or something. If they can find a place to stockpile it in a tank, they're going to be able to sell it later. So it makes sense to continue producing. But for Russia to say, look, let's go through the summer and stockpile as much oil as we can, get China to stockpile as much oil as they can so that we make money and kind of build up our cash reserves. And then we're going to intentionally take our oil off the global market for 4 months, starting October 1st until January 1st. And at that point, when we put it back on the market, the price will be a lot higher. And they'll probably be selling futures in the international market so that they can deliver against them later. There's plenty of room for Russia to be making some really strategic moves here. And I think that that the West is, from what I can see, playing into them.
I want to go back to just what you were saying earlier about the American consumer, because I want to get to the topic of gas prices here. It's on the list. But I remember last week or the week prior, I was having dinner with our good friend Chris Martinson, and I was talking to him about food shortages and whatnot. And he said, I don't know that I'd be overly concerned with outright food shortages, definitely prices going up in the US. But he said, what you have to realize is the US might not be short on food or stuff, but they're long on expectations. Therefore, you get to that breaking point a lot faster, even though the standard of living hasn't gone down in the United States to what it might be in Mexico, right? You still get the pitchforks and the torches. So on that note, I think one main area of concern for the United States, putting it mildly, one area of anger probably, is gas prices. So what are you seeing with gas prices? And I know on the list here, we wanted to touch base on how people, including myself, think it's all about the oil producers and how it's maybe less about the producers and more about the refineries.
Well, what's happened since Biden took office is he first attacked the fossil fuel industry and announced as a matter of policy that his goal was to, put them out of business, so to speak, and the future was all going to be electric vehicles and green energy and so forth. And just to be clear, I agree that those are all good goals. We ought to be electrifying the economy. We ought to be phasing out fuels. We ought to be doing all these things. But you don't want to phase out the old before you phase in the new. You got to replace fossil fuels with something. And what Biden is trying to do is to vilify the energy production industry, the oil and gas industry, make them out to be bad guys, and essentially try to put them out of business before providing a ready replacement that can satisfy the demand that oil and gas provides for now. So one of the things that results in is not as much investment in finding and building new oil wells. The thing is, these shale wells have a fairly short life cycle. You build them, you frack them, you produce a few years with them, and you pretty much got all the oil you're going to get out of them, unless you refrack them, which is a big investment, almost as big as drilling a new well. So you run them through. You can make more oil wells, but the thing is, to make a new refinery, you're building a massive bit of machinery whose whole purpose is to refine a fossil fuel that everybody agrees ought to be phased out of existence. So why in the world would anybody invest money? And it's not a little bit of money, it's lots of money, billions and billions of dollars, in building a brand new refinery in the United States, when all governments around the world have made it their policy that they're going to do everything they can on the fastest possible schedule to eliminate fossil fuels as a source of energy. I mean, why would anybody build a new refinery? So what's going on right now is Biden is saying, hey, wait a minute, the price of gas is higher. We've had oil prices as high as they are right now. We've had that before, but we didn't have gas prices this high. Right. So surely it can only be one thing, which is evil Republicans, right wingers, must be in some kind of grand conspiracy to attack the Biden administration. Well, of course, that's not it. It's simple economics. If you attack the refining industry and you make it completely impractical for anyone to want to invest in either building a new refinery or even doing a major renovation or upgrade on an existing refinery, because the payback just isn't there, well, all of a sudden there's not as much refining capacity, and that means that the crack spreads, we call them, the profit margin on refining has to go up because capacity has gone down. Why did capacity come? Why did Joe Biden is very upset because profit margins are up for refiners. Why are they up for refiners? Because nobody's willing to invest in new refineries. Why is nobody willing to invest in new refineries? Because of Joe Biden's policies, telling them that they're going to be treated as criminals if they do. And then you've got the whole ESG Wall Street revolution. And I think what's happened there is a lot of the people who are running these funds have figured out, okay, this is more of an emotional experience for my investor. They say they want to help the environment. They say they want social governance. They want good stuff. But reality is what they respond to the most is, we're going to punish bad guys and put them out of business. And so if you have people whose emotions that are driving them to invest in these ESG funds want to see those funds never, ever invest in anything that has petroleum in its name on it, then they're not going to touch it because they don't want to lose those investors. And the very best thing you could do right now for the environment would be to build green refineries and, get smarter about how you build and frack oil wells so that they're more environmentally responsible. You would engage in the extractive industries and make them greener as opposed to trying to put them out of business. But that's not what sells. The emotion that sells is, invest with my ESG fund. We're going to put the big oil companies out of business. Well, think about it this way, for every big oil company you put out of business, that just means that the remaining oil companies are competing that much harder and the prices go up that much more. If anything, what we need is more big oil companies and more refineries so that we could actually get these prices down. So input cost of the crude oil is a big part of this. That's going to go up as a result of Biden's policies. And the cost of refining that crude oil into finished products is going to continue going up as a result of Biden's policies. And he's trying to blame the price of crude oil on Putin and blame the refining margins on big oil companies. That's not where the blame lies. And unfortunately, I don't think President Biden is, so smart that he's just doing all this stuff on purpose. I think he genuinely doesn't get it. You listen to this guy talk about how he's going to solve the inflation problem for the consumer by throwing money at it. And when one of his advisors was asked, well, when you came up with this plan to buy votes by promising to eliminate student debt, or at least the first $10,000 of student debt, or whatever it is, did you stop and think about what that would do to inflation? If all of a sudden people that had big student loan payments and student loan debt were suddenly relieved of that debt, that is encouraging people to spend more. And that means more inflation. Biden has actually said in press conferences, don't worry about inflation. We're going to throw so much money at it, it won't be a problem. Well, wait a minute. That means you don't understand how it works and what it is. So I think we're in really big trouble here, and the leadership of the country is not aware of its own actions exacerbating these problems.
Looking at the glass half full, do you think that a significant bear market would cure that ESG problem? Because what I mean by that is, I think if you're living in an environment for the last 12 years where everyone knows that asset prices just go up, so it's not a matter of whether you make money or lose money. It's simply a matter of, do you make a 12% return or a 10% return? So if you can make a 10% return with ESG and feel good about it, then why not? But now we could be facing a world where people need to make difficult decisions, like, do you want to get a 5% return, or do you want to get a negative 25% return? And if it's negative 25% return in ESG, now all of a sudden, okay, I'm out. Feeling good about saving whales is fantastic, but at the end of the day, I need to make money. And do you think there could be a component there if we see, again, a significant bear market?
Well, I think that a big bear market, and particularly, I think actually the bear market, for the reasons you're describing, would probably have some of those effects. But I think what's going to do it more is going to be just ridiculously high energy prices, causing a consumer reaction, which is, look, okay, all that talk about green energy and world getting better, it sounded good. I was willing to go along with it and nod my head too, because, hey, how do you say no to better, greener, smarter,
clean air? Yeah, everyone wants
that. Everyone wants that. That's good. Now that we're starting to put a price tag on it, you say, oh, the cost of these policies, of these climate policies that everybody was also excited about, is $10 gasoline. I think that's where a whole lot of people probably go from one extreme to another.
Right.
And they're just do whatever the hell you have to do to get the gasoline prices down. The problem is going to be there's so much lead time that gets built up in it all. So what we have mostly right now is a lack of refining capacity. The way you get more refining capacity is build another refinery. That takes billions of dollars and years to build. We haven't been doing any of that because for the last several years, this ESG trend has made it essentially uninvestable to consider building a new U.S. refinery. So we're not going to have any more refineries. And I don't see that as changing. So at that point, what happens? And my guess is there's just this angry sentiment change where people say, get the gas price down no matter what you have to do. And I suspect that at that point, unfortunately, it's too late. There's nothing to do to get the gas price down. And the worst thing ultimately that you could do is the one that they'll probably choose, which is they say, okay, we've got a real problem, which is people are going to lose their shit. And we're in really big political trouble. Existing government's going to get voted out of office if we don't do something fast. What are we going to do? and they say, we're going to provide a subsidy. So in order to help Americans who are struggling with these high gas prices, there's going to be some kind of stimmy check that gets mailed to you that, you know, covers your first X number of gallons of gasoline per person or something that's, you know, at the latest prices. So you've got uh, a subsidized energy component for the consumer.
Do you think they'll pair that up with price controls? So they put a cap on the price of gas and then give you the stimmy in addition to that?
Yeah, that would be the optimum stupidity all packed into one place. Provide a stimulus that's likely to push prices higher, then cap the prices.
Yeah.
So what you end up with is massive shortages. Nobody has what they need. Everybody is stuck waiting in line for gasoline, you know, like the 1970s, and everybody's pissed off. But yeah, I think that from everything all the political tea leaves, the way I'm reading them say, yeah, I think governments are inclined to do exactly the stupidest possible thing. So a combination of price controls and a subsidy at the same time would be about the stupidest combination possible.
Yeah, that's what I've been talking about on my channel for the last 6 months or so, as far as looking into 2023 or 2024. And on that note, I mean, that kind of goes hand in hand with the food shortage that you were talking about earlier, which is the next topic of discussion. So, I mean, could you see the same thing happen with food, meaning like food stimmies plus a price control on food, which would really, really get bad because that would create shortages in the United States, I'm assuming, not just high prices.
Yeah, I think that the food crisis going out of control is going to more likely lead to faster government response of stimulus and subsidy. And the reason I say that is if you've got energy prices out of control and you can't afford to put more gasoline in your tank, you're pissed off, but you're still living. You know, if you can't eat, that's a whole different story. And when you know, history is very clear on this. When people get to the point where basic sustenance of life, that, you know, the food that they need to feed their families is not available at a price that they can afford it, or they can't afford the gasoline to go and buy it, or what have you, that's when people just start to burn shit down. Mm-hmm. And you know, and that puts the government in a very difficult position of saying, okay, now we really have to do something. And we've backed ourselves into a corner because we've ignored all the good advice that people like you have been suggesting on podcasts like yours for the last umpteen years. And we're backed in a corner and we don't know what to do. Food prices are going to go out of sight as a result of this fertilizer shortage. Crops are going to be smaller. And I think that there will have to be subsidies, and in many parts of the world, there will be riots and major unrest and unfortunately, probably starvation and loss of life. So it's a really, really ugly situation. And it's been easy to see coming. Lots of people have been writing about it. I don't see governments doing anything proactive to get ready for it or to actually reduce it. If anything, they're talking about more stimulus. That's not going to help.
What do you think a food shortage looks like in the U.S. specifically? Does it just mean that instead of 3 brands of macaroni and cheese, now there's just one? Or does it mean that there's, you know, a lot less on the shelves? Or, you know, how does that look for the average American?
I think that what happens is we start running out of certain key things as a result of runaway fertilizer and grain prices and so forth. And it's one of these very difficult to predict phenomena, because at first it starts to push the prices of things through the roof, but then you get to the point where people just don't want to consider any kind of luxury item anymore. So the luxury stuff, the caviar and the filet mignon, actually starts to come off in price because nobody's even considering that stuff. And it's the basic staples that are in the most demand. I think you get to a point, you know, we're already seeing the very first cracks in the armor here. We've got a global shortage of sriracha hot sauce. that's obviously not something that people are unable to live without. When you start to get to, okay, everything that's made from corn or everything that's made from wheat is doubling in price, then things really start to get ugly, and that has knock-on effects, and people start to substitute with other things, and it creates all kinds of imbalances, and you probably end up with too much of some things and not enough of other things.
Yeah. Okay. So talking about stupid government policies, let's dive into the SPR. I know you've been talking about this.
Oh
It's
boy.
one of your favorite topics on Macro Voices.
Well, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created in 1975 for very, very good reason, which is the Arab oil embargo was really not that big of a geopolitical event at the time. But the United States, which at that point was no longer energy sufficient, and don't let anybody tell you that the US is energy self-sufficient now. That's nonsense. The Biden administration said that a few times, but it's absolutely not true. We import a whole lot of oil, and we could not get by without it. So we have to have imports of oil. And what the powers that be realized after the Arab oil embargo is they said, wait a minute, this was kind of about price and you know, the Yom Kippur War and policy, and you know, that all got sorted out. But what would we do if we were ever in an actual war situation where the only way you can run the ships and the planes and everything else is to have petroleum to make jet fuel with, and you know, be ready to refuel all the F-18s and F-35s, whatever they fly these days, and run the war machine and do all that. What if somebody were to use some kind of shipping blockade to stop those ships from getting through, and the US were cut off from oil? We could be literally crippled to the point where we're unable to make war and defend ourselves, and we could be in really deep doo-doo. So what they did more than 50 years ago in 1970, well, I guess it was 47 years ago, not more than 50 years ago, almost 50 years ago, in 1975, they established the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which can hold up to about 700 and I forget, around 750 million barrels of oil. And the idea, and even that is not very much. We use 20 million barrels a day. So, and some of that is produced inside the United States. We don't import 20 million barrels a day, but at the rate that we've been drawing it down, and what's happened, the reason for having the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is it's strategic. It's for not just a slightly rainy day. It's for when it's really, really pouring outside. Yeah, when it's life or death, and you realize that the next tactic that I think is very possibly coming in this war with Vladimir Putin is Putin cuts off all Russian oil. Oil prices go to $350 in the matter of 2 weeks. And all of the sudden, nobody can afford anything. And we've got a question mark as to whether we're going to be able to supply the oil that's needed in order to just run the military. And it's a big uncertainty. Well, that's what you've got a Strategic Petroleum Reserve for, was if the US ever got cut off from foreign oil, we would have enough of those supplies in stock in order to get through the storm, use the oil that we have in-house in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to run the military and go kick some ass and, you know, fix the war and get things to a point where we've got oil again. That was the whole point of it. For most of the 47 years that we've had this thing, we didn't really need it. You know, it was started in 75, 15 years later, we got the end of the Cold War with the fall of the Soviet Union, and there weren't really a lot of big strategic threats anymore. But we continued to keep the Strategic Petroleum Reserve just so we would have it in case we ever needed it. Well, right now, we've got talk of nuclear escalation with Russia. We've got the rhetoric and the talk that's in the system right now is the most dangerous that we've had since the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, in in 60 years. This is finally the time where it looks like we may be headed to a period, let's say a year from now, where we really urgently need that strategic petroleum reserve in order to save the country's existence. That's how important it is. What are we doing right now? President Biden is draining it down at the rate of about 7 million barrels per week, thinking that that's going to somehow help to address short-term gasoline prices through the summer and, get him through the midterm elections or something. It's not going to work. It's already making the situation worse. And what we're doing is, after sitting on this strategic petroleum reserve for 45 years, all of a sudden, as the tidal wave is actually in sight approaching the shore, President Biden decides to cancel the flood insurance and sell off the oil in the SPR in a desperate and ineffective attempt to control prices at the pump. It's not going to work long term, and we don't have enough oil to do that. The SPR is now down to its lowest level since 1986. It's below 500 million barrels. It's because we consume more than we did back in 1986. I was
going to say our economy is a lot bigger.
So in terms of the way you really want to think about it, which is how many days of American oil consumption are there in the SPR if we didn't produce any and we just had to live off of it like a piggy bank? It's down to about 26 days right now. Now, it wouldn't ever really come down to 26 days because you're still producing oil in the US. But if somebody were thinking about this, they would say, wait a minute, the dynamics of the entire oil industry have changed dramatically in the last 40 years since they established this thing. We used to be stockpiling the light sweet crude, which is easy to refine. That's, kind of what we wanted to have in there in case we needed it. But these days, the oil that is produced in the US, the shale oil, is super, super light. That means it needs to be, you can't refine it in an American refinery the way it is, the way it comes out of the ground. It has to be blended down with a heavier blend stock. Where does all of that heavy blend stock come from? It's imported. We don't make it in the United States at all. It all gets imported. So you would think somebody would be thinking here and say, wait a minute, what we really need is to have the entire SPR filled with heavy blend stock, the stuff that you need to mix with American oil, so that we could have the American oil and the SPR together in the right proportions in order to supply our refineries and make the oil that we need in order to, have finished products, create jet fuel, and be able to win the war. We're not doing any of that. All we're doing is taking this big, huge piggy bank of crude oil, and we're selling it off as if, there were no consequence to doing so.
And that's not even the problem. It's the refiners.
That's right. And it's not going to do anything to change the cost of refining. And if anything, what we should be doing here is we should be looking at the SPR in terms of what kind of oil it contains. Look for what kind of oil we most urgently need to supplement that with, so that we would have all of the right combinations to mix together to create our own oil from American, American produced shale oil. Needs to be blended down. So we'd want to stock up and fill the SPR all the way up to its absolute capacity with just the right grades of blend stock, so that, it normally, if you've got a reserve that's supposed to be there just in case there's a war or something, and you go for 40 or 50 years and there is no big war and you didn't really need it, and all of a sudden it looks like the war might be coming, that's the time to fill it up, not the time to drain it. It's insane that we're doing this. And it's not having any effect. And if we were to continue, what's going to happen is, if we continue and the prices go up and somebody says it is so irresponsible, and nobody's even saying this at this point, I don't know why, but if it ever were to become a public talking point and somebody said, you got to stop draining the SPR at 7 million barrels a week. If they stopped suddenly, that would spike the price of gasoline. And everybody would say, oh my God. So supposedly the Biden administration, they wanted to look good. So what they did in the spring is they said, we're going to have a plan for replenishing. See, we're very responsible about these things. We've got a plan for how come fall at the end of summer driving season, we're going to replenish all of that oil in the SPR that we just took out. Trust us, we're the government. Well, I'm sure that probably President Biden actually thinks he's going to be able to do that. And he probably thinks that, well, once we get through the summer and summer driving season's over, price of oil is going to go back down to $60 and we'll be able to replenish all that oil at $60. What happens when we get to Labor Day and the price of oil is already at $140 and the price of gasoline is at $7? And at that point, do you think he's going to stop draining the SPR? I mean, how could he stop then, right? How could you, if you're coming into election season, you're going to stop taking oil out of the SPR and you're going to allow that to spike gasoline prices just into the fall elections? You're not going to do that.
Yeah,
so
you like know QE, there's Eric. It's like QE.
So you know that there's no way that they're going to stop once they've started. Well, guess what, George? The whole thing, the remaining 500, it's actually 490 million barrels of oil that we have in the SPR now, down from 700 and something. That'll only last at the current drawdown rate a little over a year. It's about 15 months. So just about the time that we would be drawing it down to zero kind of coincides with about when I was thinking if Putin really plays hardball, we would get to an actual shooting war type of situation, as we have no strategic petroleum reserve remaining. Yeah. Meanwhile, what's the best way for Putin to game this whole system? The best thing for him to do is to be cutting a deal right now with Xi Jinping, saying, look, we got to, turn on your Chinese ability to do things quickly. You got to just build tanks, makeshift lean-to tanks if you have to. Make as many tanks as you can. Keep buying Russian oil through the summer. Keep buying when we take it off the market intentionally in order to spike prices higher. We're still going to give China a good deal. Keep buying it then so we don't have to shut in our wells. And we're going to keep stockpiling it in Russia too. We're going to take it off the market. And just as we've taken all of that oil off the market and we've spiked prices to the moon, that's when the U.S. is going to run out of its SPR, right, and not have any left to drain down. And that's when we're really going to be in a strong strategic position. I think that Putin is smart enough to have all of this stuff figured out and all the dominoes lined up in a row. And everything the West does, every time they do something, they're all proud of themselves. Look at us. We just imposed very, very tough sanctions. We're going to punish Russia. Result of that, higher prices for Americans, higher prices for Europeans, and higher oil revenue and higher oil profits for Russia.
Yeah.
And China gets a bargain. Discounted prices.
Yeah, it's always a stronger counterpunch. So we talked about Putin wanting to, or how he would play hardball. But one last thing I wanted to get your opinion on is something I've heard in the news that doesn't make any sense to me, but maybe you can shed some light on this, where we're getting this buyer's cabal, for lack of a better phrase. And they're saying, well, we're going to show Putin, we're going to bring down these prices by just saying that we're only willing to pay $40 a barrel or something like that. And that's how we're going to bring the price down. It seems like that won't work. What am I missing?
Yeah, I was thinking about hiring all of the Victoria's Secret models as hookers, except I'm only going to pay them $40.
There you go.
Now, I haven't consulted with them yet to see whether they're on board with this deal. But I'm thinking if I just, if you and I form a pact that we're not willing to pay more than $40 for a Victoria's Secret model,
right?
Then surely we can control the price, can't we?
And it's a great recession-proof business, Eric.
I don't think so. So let's first cover what this nonsense is about. The G7, I guess what they're thinking is they could, in their minds, impose a price cap on Russian oil. So you're allowed to buy Russian oil, but you have to buy it cheap. So everybody would get a bargain. And Russia would just go along with this somehow. And what they'll do is if there's anybody that tries to buy Russian oil at a higher price than that, they'll yank a lot of the ships are insured by Lloyd's of London, and so the UK has some control over that. They'll yank the insurance on the ship that is on the tanker ship that's delivering the Russian crude, and they won't be able to deliver it, and that'll take care of it. That's sort of the plan as far as they seem to have figured it out. What would happen is, I think probably the reason they're still talking about this is most people don't understand it, and it still sounds like the government is planning on doing something that punishes Russia, and government must be doing something good for us. They're working on something, sounds good. If they were actually to do this, it immediately wouldn't work. There will be plenty of people that would just buy oil from Russia at the price that Russia wants to sell it for, and make arrangements to use a ship that either ends up going uninsured or that is insured by somebody else, or the Chinese government insures it because UK wasn't willing to, or who knows what. The next step then, and I think this is where it gets really scary, would be if the West were to get even stupider after that and say, okay, well, if you're going to play that game, we can play at that game. We're going to impose a military blockade. We're going to stop any ships delivering Russian oil from leaving Russian waters. We're going to blockade them. If anybody tries to get through, their ship will be sunk because we're playing tough now. If they did that, it would immediately push the price of oil north of $350. I mean, wow. It would create a situation where you really would be taking that oil off of the market. You'd be creating an outright war with Russia and China. It would be really scary. So I don't think that's going to happen either. But what is apparently going to happen is we're not going to do any making sense yet. We're going to continue to go through the motions of let's talk tough about how we're going to punish Russia with sanctions. Well, the reality of the situation is the West doesn't have the leverage to impose any sanctions on Russia that are going to do any meaningful damage. And the more that they do these backfiring things, the more that they're just helping Russia. Russia is not playing hardball yet. When they do, it's going to get ugly, and it's going to get ugly fast. And I think, unfortunately, that blockade is probably coming at some point, where at some point it will be, okay, any Russian oil is considered illegal oil. And if it's illegal oil, that means we're allowed to seize it and keep the oil. So, we'll find a tanker that's carrying Russian oil from Russia to China, intercept it, basically do a US military or UK military led, we're seizing your ship here and the oil on it, and we're going to take it to Houston, and we'll keep the oil because it's a prisoner of war or something. And we stole your FX reserves. We're going to steal your oil next. You can do that stuff for a while, and eventually you're dealing with a nuclear superpower that things get ugly, it escalates, it turns nuclear. You're risking end of the world if you start to play this game. And unfortunately, I think we are in a situation where we're headed toward very incompetent Western leadership, risking the end of the world. And I'm not saying that Russia are the good guys, or that what they've done in Ukraine is good stuff. I'm not endorsing that by any means, but everything that I can see is Putin is a very competent bad guy. Even if he's a bad guy, he knows exactly what he's doing. He's thought this through, and he's got a plan, and he's in a very good position, I think, to really show the West up here. If you go back to the Arab oil embargo, at that time, We had President Nixon in office, Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State. Those are some pretty nasty guys, frankly, but they were smart, nasty guys.
Yeah.
You know, Nixon was a very shrewd, I think, to some extent, maybe not the most ethical, not the most honorable president that the United States has ever seen. But between Nixon and Kissinger, they got it. They understood the economics. They knew exactly what was at risk. They invented the petrodollar system in order to save the dollar after the famous default from Bretton Woods. So they knew exactly what was going on. They were maybe nasty guys, but they were shrewd and competent nasty guys. What we have now in terms of Western leadership is he doesn't get it. He doesn't even understand what's at risk here. And draining down the Strategic Petroleum Reserve when it looks like we're headed toward the first time in history where we're really and truly going to need it is just insane. Yeah. And, Putin knows exactly what's going on. He's no dummy, but he's just sitting back saying, I don't have to do any playing tough here. The West is doing it for me. They're handing him on a silver platter. The sanctions have benefited Russia, and they've been a detriment to American and European consumers.
Yeah, so many people on Twitter and everything, they always talk about how Putin is, losing the war. And again, I dislike Russia, but I dislike all governments. So I don't like the Canadian government. I don't like the Australian government. I think they're all bad guys and they're all crooks. I'm for the people, but I kind of take pause when people say that Putin is losing. And I say, well, it depends on what his objectives are, right? If his objectives are to take over Ukraine in 3 days, yeah, he's losing big time. But if his objectives are to gain leverage over the United States, cause a recession in Western Europe, maybe have central banks start using gold as a reserve asset instead of treasuries or the dollar, maybe he's not losing so badly. I don't know.
Well, look at Sergei Glazyev's architecture for a new global monetary system that's based on a state-sponsored digital reserve currency, which is backed by natural resources. I mean, that's what they want to get to. And I think that Putin is not in a short-term war with Ukraine. I think he's in a war there's a battle of Ukraine, which is the first shooting battle. But I think that what Putin has embarked on is a war with the West that is designed toward the outcome of displacing the US dollar as the global reserve currency and replacing it with a digital currency that Russia, China, and some other group of BRICS actors sponsor. That's what, and I'm not saying he's going to win, but that's what the game is. I think that's on Putin's mind is what do we need to do in order to get the West into a situation where they have no choice but to capitulate and allow a new monetary world order to take over, where the US dollar is not the center of the system anymore. And that sounds just totally unthinkable. And I think Americans really have a serious problem that is the last 30 years of foreign policy. We've had all of these little wars with Iraq and Afghanistan, even if you go back to Vietnam, a war that we were unable to win. Okay, these are not well-armed adversaries. These are itsy bitsy little countries with minuscule military resources in contrast to what the US has. And we've still had really thorny, difficult situations in these wars. They're hard to get out of. And I think what happens is people get to a complacency where they assume, okay, I know what a war is like. It's happened a lot of times in my life. I remember the one with Iraq. I remember the one with Afghanistan. If you're as old as you and I are, you might even remember as a kid the war with Vietnam. Well, okay, wait a minute. Those are all wars that were with, David and Goliath wars, where there was just no comparison. Now, from everything I'm reading, and I'm not a military expert, from everything I'm reading, The US is behind Russia and China right now, especially with respect to hypersonic weapons, which are the new missiles that can go so fast that all of the intercept systems and so forth that are designed to protect us from those missiles wouldn't be effective against them. They're miles ahead. They've also got carrier killer missile technology designed to sink US aircraft carriers. They've got all the toys that they need. What you'd really want to do would be back the US into a situation where you somehow send Russian agents in to blow up its strategic petroleum reserve so the US doesn't have any strategic petroleum in reserve. Well, they don't have to do that. President Biden's doing it for them. Yeah, right. All they have to do is sit back and say, okay, so you're going to tap your SPR. You're going to basically give me this huge, massive strategic advantage that you're going to be without energy and unable to defend yourself when we get to the real war. And all I have to do, if I'm Vladimir Putin, is sit back, enjoy the summer of 2022, not do anything, let the West impose whatever its next list of sanctions are that just pushes the price of oil higher and keeps keeps the oil revenue coming in for Russia, so Russia can build up its cash and oil reserves, and China can do the same and prepare themselves. And I'm sure that Russia is telling Xi Jinping, you want to build more SPR storage capacity, partly because we can give you a good price, but partly because you're going to need it, because the war that's coming with the West is going to be a big one. And we're going to get to a situation. If you wanted to put the US, I'm not a military guy, I'm not a military planner, but from what little I know about it, if you're able to starve the US of its petroleum reserve so it doesn't really have it, then you take Russian oil off the market just to spike the prices crazy high. That means it's very hard for anybody to get any oil. At that point, governments would probably step in with price controls, and that means that civilian use of energy is curtailed dramatically. Only the military has unlimited access to it. Putin is doing exactly the right strategic thing on his war. He's sitting back, relaxing, and letting Biden do all the work for him right now.
Well, you heard it here first on the Rebel Capitalist show, this bombshell that Trump is not the Putin plant. It's actually Biden. All right, Erik. Well, I sure appreciate your time. Incredible conversation as always, and some fantastic insights. For people who want to find out more about what you do, the podcast, where can they go check that out?
Macrovoices.com.
Easy peasy. All right, Erik, have a good one. I can't wait to do it again.
Okay, it's been a pleasure, George. We'll see you later.